The Rambam writes in the beginning of Hilchas Tshuva, Kol mitzvah shebetorah, all the mitzvahs in the Torah, bein aseh, bein leisasa, whether it is a positive commandment or a negative commandment. Im avar adam malachas mehem, if a person violated one of them, bein bezoden, bein b'shgaga, whether deliberately or inadvertently, kishiyas et tshuva v'yoshuv mecheto, when he does tshuva and he repents of a sin, chayav lehisvados lifnei hakel baruch hu, he is obligated to confess before God. Shenemar, as is written, ish o isha, man or woman, ki yasu mikol chatei sa'adam, if they should commit any sin, v'izvadu es chatasam asher asu, they shall confess the sin that they committed. This confession is a positive commandment. So one of the 613 mitzvahs is the mitzvah of vidui. That when a person does tshuva, he is obligated to verbalize the confession. The commentaries point out that the Rambam does not count tshuva itself as a mitzvah. Doing tshuva is not one of the 613 mitzvahs. Doing tshuva is like breathing. You don't have to be commanded. Of course you're going to do tshuva. The person did an aveira. How can you not repent? You don't need the Torah to command that. You need the Torah to command things that you wouldn't have done otherwise. But tshuva, of course you do tshuva. The mitzvah is that when you do tshuva, the tshuva should not remain merely a thought, but it should be put into words. And the Rambam, in fact, understands that the vidui is not only an admission of guilt. The vidui really is a verbalization of the entire process of tshuva. The Rambam writes, Keitzad mizvadim, how does the person recite the vidui? Omer, he says, Ona Hashem, please Hashem. Chatasi avisi pashati lefanecha, I sinned before you, v'osisi kach v'kach, and I did such and such. V'rinichamti, I am remorseful. Ubayishti b'masai, and I am embarrassed. U'la'olam eini chozer l'dorazeh, and I will never go back. I commit myself to never going back. So the vidu is not only a confession of guilt, it is first of all the expression of remorse, and it is also the expression of resolve not to repeat the sin. This is the fundamental element of vidui. Why is it so important? Tshuva, as we said, you're doing anyway. You don't need the Torah to command you to do tshuva. Of course you're going to do tshuva. The Torah is saying, but when you do tshuva, make sure you do it with a vidui. Make sure you verbalize it. Why is it so important to verbalize it? So in the past, we pointed out two aspects of this. Number one, because words are more solid and more firm than thoughts. Something which is only a thought kind of is floating around there in your brain. It doesn't have a firmness. It's not solid. You put it into words, there's a greater sense of commitment, a greater sense of resolve. So the Torah says that when you do tshuva, it's not enough to have thoughts of tshuva, you have to put it into words. And that certainly is true. Another aspect, which is that until you perform a vidui, tshuva is nothing more than self-improvement. When you stand before God and you speak to Him, you are working to repair a relationship. Let's imagine the following. Imagine you have a marriage. Husband and wife. The marriage is on the rocks. The husband has really been irresponsible in the marriage. And the husband resolves, I'm going to be a better husband. Unilaterally. Doesn't speak to his wife. Doesn't apologize to his wife. Doesn't ask for forgiveness. Doesn't commit himself to her. But on his own he decides, I'm going to start doing this and being more thoughtful and taking out the trash, bringing flowers once in a while, and so on and so forth. Okay? It's an improvement. up to a point. But if you really want to repair the relationship, at some point, he has to come and speak to her. And say, I'm sorry. I was foolish. I did these things. I commit myself to being better. But you can't repair a relationship unilaterally. You can only repair a relationship bilaterally. So here the Torah says that, okay, you feel remorse, and you're embarrassed, and you want to change. That's very nice. That's all self-improvement. But Tshuva is more than self-improvement. Tshuva is the rectification of a damaged relationship. That means you stand before God and you speak to Him. And that's what vidui is. The Ram emphasizes that. Chayav lizvados lifnei hakeil. You are mizvada before God. Meaning that vidui is not talking to yourself. Vidui is talking to God. It's very interesting that on Yom Kippur we fulfill the vidui as part of the Shemona Esrei, part of the silent prayer. It was inserted into the silent prayer, into the Chazan's repetition of the silent prayer. So why is that? Because as the Rambam writes in the laws of Tefillah, that what is the fundamental kavana? What is the person's attitude meant to be when he recites the silent prayer? He's meant to see himself as standing before God. He's speaking to God. The Rambam holds that that kavana is so important. It's more important than the kavana of understanding the meaning of the words. According to the analysis of Reb Chaim Brisker and the Rambam, knowing the translation of the words is not a necessary requirement in the entire Shemona Esrei. As long as you understand the meaning of the first blessing, that's good enough. But the requirement that you see yourself as standing before God, that is required from beginning to end. That means it's more important to see yourself as speaking to God than it is that you should know what you're saying. It's an amazing thing.
It means you're standing before God not knowing what you're saying.
Well, most people, that's the case. Most people, when they pray in Hebrew, don't know what they're saying, right? But they know I am saying the words that the rabbis want me to say to God. So therefore, they discharge the obligation of prayer. But if they don't see themselves as speaking to God, that's it. It's not a prayer at all. They haven't gotten the first base. But now we understand why the vidui is associated with the prayer. Because if the vidui also has to be said in the presence of God, I am speaking to God, so there's no more appropriate time than in the Shemona Esrei. But tonight I'd like to speak about a third aspect of vidui. It's not an aspect which is codified in the halacha, but it's an aspect of vidui which found its way into our siddur, into our slichas, and it's rooted in a parsha of the Chumash. When we say slichas, so we know that the fundamental vidui is the paragraph Oshamnu, Bogadnu, Gazalnu, which follows the Aleph base. Now probably there are more synonyms for sin. That you can tell about a language by the number of words it gives you for the same thing. Sin is a very important concept in our culture. So in Lashon HaKodesh, in the Holy Tongue, there are many, many, many synonyms for sin. Now, there's no such thing as an exact synonym, because every word has a slightly different connotation. But because we are very conscious of the concept of sin, so we have a wealth of words for sin. We probably don't use all of them. There are probably more. But we follow the Aleph base. Aleph, Hashamnu, Beis, Bogadnu, Gimel, Gazalnu, Dal, Divarna, Dofi, and so on and so forth, as if to express the idea we've sinned in every conceivable way. From A to Z, from Aleph to Taf. We've done them all. And for good measure, for Taf, we don't only have one expression, we have two extras. So there are 24 expressions of sin in this litany. And then we say, as a follow-up, Sarnu mimitzveisecha umishpatecha hatovim. We have turned away from your commandments and your good laws, v'lo shava lanu, and it was not worth it. It was not worth it. Now, this is a very important thing. The Gemara says that the people that are Moshlim b'Yitzram, the people that have domination over the Yetzer Hara, make calculations. They are mechashet cheshbono shel olam. They make calculations about life, about the world. And the main calculation they make is that the imagined benefit of a sin is always outweighed by the loss, and the imagined loss that comes from doing a mitzvah is always outweighed by the ultimate benefit. Chazal say. And this is a calculus we all have to make. When a person sins, why does a person sin? The person thinks he's going to have some benefit. And if he keeps his business open Shabbos, he'll make a lot of money. Because Saturday is a good day for doing business. Or if he eats this treif thing, it will give him nourishment and make him feel better, and so on and so forth. So a person sins because he makes a calculation that there is a reward, there is a benefit that will come to you from doing the Aveira. When you take everything into consideration, you discover it's not worth it. That the ultimate loss far, far, far outweighs the imagined benefit. So that's the first calculation a person has to make, that the imagined benefit is outweighed by the ultimate loss. When it comes to a mitzvah, it's the other way. Right? Why do we neglect doing mitzvahs? Because we imagine that doing the mitzvah will cause me a loss. It costs money, takes time, so it's not worth it. But then you make a calculation and you discover that the ultimate benefits far, far, far outweigh the temporary loss. So if a person would make these calculations, the person would always do the right thing and avoid the wrong thing. So the Gemara says that the Moshlim b'Yitzram, the people that rule over the Yetzer Hara, they make these cheshbonos, they make these calculations. So the Vidui makes that point exactly. The Vidui says that we turned away from the mitzvahs. We've come to understand that it wasn't worth it. We thought that we'd have some benefit from turning away, from not doing the mitzvahs, from doing the averas, but we discover lo shavalanu, that it isn't worth it. Now this expression, by the way, comes of course from Haman, from Megillas Esther. When Haman said that I have so much, I'm fabulously wealthy, I have many, many children, risen to a position of power, V'chol zeh einenu shoveli, but all of this is worth nothing when I see Mordechai the Jew not bowing. So the idea of something being shava means it's worth it. Right here it's low shava, it's not worth it. We discovered that turning away from mitzvahs is not worth it. Let me continue. V'atot tzadik al kol habo aleinu, and you are righteous in all that has come upon us. Ki emes osisa, for you have done the truth, v'anachnu hirshanu, and we have been wicked. But what does this mean? You are righteous in all that has come upon us. Now tonight we're going to face up to a very uncomfortable fact, very uncomfortable reality. One of the most fundamental principles of Judaism is the principle of schar v'einesh, reward and punishment. And when a person experiences misfortune, what is the immediate reaction meant to be? Chazal say, Imraya Adam Yisurin Shaboyim Alav, if a person sees that he's experiencing suffering, physical suffering, financial suffering, etc., Yifashresh b'maisav, the person has to examine his deeds. The default assumption is that this is a punishment. Now, no one wants to think in those terms. So we devise all sorts of interesting theologies to justify how there could be suffering even though I am clean as a whistle. But that's not the Jewish response, not the Jewish way. Now, the Jewish way is, Chazal tell us, that if a person experiences suffering, he has to ask himself the question, what have I done wrong? Let me just tell you an amazing story to illustrate this. I told the story before, but this is a fantastic story. There was a great guy, Mr. Zalman Meltzer. Mr. Zalman Meltzer was an elderly man, and not a well man. And his wife took good care of him. So she used to make him warm milk. And to give him warm milk to drink, this was considered therapeutic. So one day he was in the dining room of his house speaking to his students, and she was boiling some milk for him in the kitchen, and all of a sudden there were screams from the kitchen. He came running. What happened? The milk boiled over. So he said, "Are you all right?" He said, "I'm fine. Nothing happened." "So why are you screaming?" He says, "The milk boiled over." He says, "No." So the milk boiled over. Never boiled over before. Good point. So what do you think? So this is what she said, that in their neighborhood they had a milkman. And the milkman used to deliver the milk. And when he got old, he couldn't deliver the milk anymore, so a younger man took over the route. Nevertheless, the old milkman still came once a month, Erev Rosh Chodesh, to collect the payment, which he didn't deserve because the other person was delivering the milk. So people said, "Well, why are you coming for the money? You're not delivering the milk anymore." So he said, "Listen, just because I'm too old to deliver the milk, I still need parnasa. I still got a livelihood." So he used to come around and he'd collect. Needless to say, nobody, or almost nobody, gave him any money. He said, "Get out of here, old man. You're not delivering the milk anymore. We don't have to pay you." But Mr. Zalman, Rebbitzin, they were great tzaddikim, so they would pay him every month. Became Erev Rosh Chodesh. He'd knock on the door and they'd pay him his monthly payment, even though he didn't earn it. Anyway, said the Rebbitzin that month they weren't home. They had gone to a bris. And undoubtedly he came to collect the money, and we weren't there. And he probably thought that we've decided that's it, Adkan, no more. And he was very hurt. And that's why Min HaShamayim, from heaven, it was brought about that the milk should boil over, that we should realize that we committed a sin with regards to the milkman. So Mrs. Allen says, "Must be." He says, "We have to run quickly and apologize to him." So they ran to the milkman's house, and they knocked on the door, and they begged forgiveness. Said, "You probably came, and we weren't there. We were at a bris. We apologize. Here we brought the money." And he said, "Yes, I did come. And when I knocked on the door and you didn't answer, I was hurt. But I accept your apology. I understand you weren't there, and all is forgiven." But people like this, when something happened, they thought, okay, why did it happen? Things don't just happen.
They were on a level where they could maybe figure these things out, but most people can't figure out.
That's a very, very good question. So how do you figure it out? Okay, maybe we'll touch on that in a moment. But in any case, you see, they took it seriously. And most of us, whatever happens, okay, listen, things happen. Stuff happens. No big deal. So
most people would think they turned the burner up too high.
Exactly. So the point is that the Jewish attitude is, again, Chazal saying, if a person experiences suffering, the person has to ask himself, okay, why? What did I do? This must be a punishment, or at least perhaps it's a punishment. Let's say a person doesn't. Let's say a person is not willing to confess his sins. He's not willing to acknowledge that he sinned. he sees himself as being a tzaddik gomer. He sees himself as being perfectly righteous. So when he experiences suffering, what does he feel? How does he respond to suffering? It becomes a critique of God. Why me? It's not fair. God is punishing me. I'm such an honest person, a good person. I'm a tzaddik. I go to Daf Yomi. But I daven. I'm nice to people. And so on and so forth. He's punishing me? Me? In other words, a person who does not confess his sin often compounds the sin because he sees that his suffering as a critique of God. God is not running the world fairly. God is unjust. Because in a just world, a person like me wouldn't suffer. Well, this is a serious thing. We tend not to think about it. But it's important to know this, that when a person sins and brings suffering upon himself, but does not acknowledge it, he compounds the sin by raising a critique of God. It is bad enough that he did the Aveira, but on top of that, he sees himself as absolutely righteous, and God is sending me punishments? It's not fair. It's not fair, it's not right. There is an idea called Psiduk Hadin. Psiduk Hadin means to justify God's judgments. To justify God's judgments. When a person experiences misfortune, there's a blessing which he recites. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, dayon ha'emes, the true judge. That is tziduk hadin. That is justifying God's judgments. Saying that God is the dayon ha'emes, He is the true judge. That God forbid, I do not believe that anything I am experiencing is undeserved. Everything has a reason, a good reason. Maybe we'll explore some reasons. It's a complex subject. But that's what dayan ha'emes is. And this is the bracha we say whenever we experience misfortune, especially with the passing of a loved one. We say dayan ha'emes. Now, I think at this point, it's worthwhile to mention a thought which is said in the name of many Gedolim. Someone today even showed me that the Maharal says it. That we speak about God and we say, Keil Emunah ve'ein ovel. He is a trustworthy God and there is no crookedness, no dishonesty. So what does that mean? Ve'ein ovel. So the Maharal says an amazing interpretation. He says like this. He says that when God punishes a sinner, He takes into account not only the sinner, but everyone who will be affected by the sinners being punished. You know, when an earthly court puts a person on trial, the only question is he innocent or guilty? If he's guilty, he'll be convicted, he'll be sentenced, he'll be punished. How this will affect his parents, his children, his siblings, spouse, community, it's irrelevant. That's not the mandate of the court. The question before the court is simply, is this person guilty or innocent? If he's guilty, he has to serve time. Now the Ribono Shel Olam, it isn't necessary for the Ribono Shel Olam to punish a person in this world. There's always the potential to punish him in the next world where the punishment he receives will not affect anybody else. That's a viable option. So if God punishes a person in this world, it must be because He's calculated all the consequences and understands that all the consequences have a cheshbon. There is a cheshbon behind all the consequences. And therefore, a Jew, whenever he experiences misfortune, declares that God is his dayan ha'emes, meaning that forget why that person died. But even the suffering I'm experiencing in missing that person, I accept that as well. God is the dayan ha'emes. And that's what we say in the Vidui. V'atot tzadik al kol habo oleinu, whatever befalls us, whatever happens to us, whatever punishment we've received, we accept that God is tzaddik, God is just. Ki emes osisa, for you did the truth, v'anachnu hirshanu, we were wicked. So, in other words, in the vidui, we also incorporate this element of tziduk hadin. We incorporate this element of acceptance and justification of the divine judgments. This is something extra. This is something which is not codified in the Rambam, not in the Shari Tshuva Rabbi Yonah. It's a new aspect. That the importance of vidui is tziduk hadin. It is also justifying the suffering I've experienced. A person who is mechasep shav, a person who covers over his sins, a person who refuses to acknowledge them, is guilty not only of the sin, but also of a critique of God. That God is punishing me for what? I'm absolutely perfect. And in the process of tshuva, where he comes to recognize his faults, there also is an element of tziduk hadin. That I recognize that if I'm suffering, there is a reason, and I accept that, and God's judgments are true. You know, I'm a fan of American history. And, of course, Lincoln's greatest speech was the Gettysburg Address. But a close second is Lincoln's second inaugural address. If you go to the Lincoln Memorial, where they have that great getchka of Lincoln sitting on the throne, so on one wall is inscribed the Gettysburg Address, and the other wall the second inaugural address. And in the second inaugural address, he talks about the sin of American slavery. And he talks about God's judgment, that the sin of American slavery was punished by God bringing the Civil War. Some amazing insight that the ravages of the Civil War were a divine punishment for the sin of American slavery. And he writes that even if the bondsman unrequited toil will be paid for by the blood let in this war, still we must acknowledge that, he quotes the pasuk in Tehillim, Mishpatei Hashem emes, sadku yachtov, that the judgments of God are true and they are altogether righteous. In other words, the second inaugural address is a magnificent example of this concept of tziduk hadin. And there was a war. And in this war there was a lot of bloodshed, a lot of suffering. It was the bloodiest American war.
He wasn't his own suffering. He had the soldiers and the families, you know. Was he that way in his own personal life and his own personal suffering?
He was a tormented person, Lincoln, as anyone who's familiar with him knows. And ultimately, he was assassinated. His own life was taken in what can be considered a part of the war as well.
The second inaugural arrest was during the war itself.
It was during the war. It was 1 month before his assassination, 1865. And this was a tziduk hadin. He said that things don't just happen by themselves. There was America, both the South and the North, was guilty. Even the Northerners that ultimately fought against slavery were guilty for letting it last as long as it did. And he saw the war as a divine punishment for the sin of American slavery. Fantastic, fantastic speech. There's a lot more in that speech. It was just magnificent. But this is the idea of tziduk hadin. And that's what we do. That's what the authors of the Vidui inserted. They understood it's not enough just to confess, it's not just to rectify a relationship, but there's also an element of tziduk hadin. You see, maybe we don't suffer as badly as they suffered. Maybe the authors of this prayer were writing in a time that Jewish suffering was more pronounced. But they saw this as an element of the vidui. V'ata tzadik al kol haba aleinu, you are righteous in all that has come upon us, for you have done the truth, and we have been wicked. So this is another aspect of vidui. It's an element of tzito kadin. It's a justification, a justifying of God's judgments. Now, where does this come from? This is an amazing thing. In Parshas B'chukosai, we have the techacha, we have the rebuke. And the Torah tells us that what will be the consequence? The consequence of Jewish sin will be suffering in Eretz Yisrael and ultimately banishment, ultimately exile, golus from Eretz Yisrael. And it says that when Jews will be in the land of their enemies, it says, V'izvadu es avainom, they will confess their sin, v'es avain avaisam, and the sin of their fathers. They will confess their sin and the sin of their fathers. Very, very odd verse. Well, why have to confess your father's sin? I'm responsible for my own sins. I'm not responsible for my father's sins. Like, why do you have to confess your father's sins? What does this mean? V'izvadu es avainum es avan avaisam. In Golus, they will confess their sins and their father's sins. The Darchei says an amazing thing. The Darchei writes that we have to understand the context of these psukim. This vidui, this confession, takes place, let's say, in Bavel. The Jews have been exiled, the destruction of the first temple. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar has exiled the Jews to Bavel, and in Golus, the Jews will confess their sin. Who are these Jews confessing their sin? Remember, the Jews were in Bavel 70 years. We're not talking about the Jews who were exiled themselves. We're talking about their children, perhaps their grandchildren. Now, undoubtedly, they've committed sins too. No such thing as a tzaddik.
Is this their vidui? Like their...
This is their vidui. This is their vidui. The grandchildren of the original exiles are saying vidui. But if they would only confess their own sin, and they would say, our parents were absolutely righteous, and our grandparents were absolutely righteous. And the truth is that you can make a very solid case for that. That should a child look at his parents as having sinned? Or his grandparents as having sinned? Okay, my own sins I've sinned. But my parents, tzaddikim, my grandparents, even greater tzaddikim. Right? A person shouldn't look askance at his forebears. But it comes out that in this instance, if this person would say, okay, I'm guilty of sin, but my parents, my grandparents are totally innocent. They are white as the driven snow. Well, why were they exiled then? Why were they exiled? I was born in Bavel. I was born here, right? How did I get here? Why am I not in Eretz Yisrael? Because my grandparents were exiled. So if I would take the position, okay, listen, I acknowledge that I've sinned. I'm not perfect. But my parents, my grandparents, they're perfect. So why were they exiled then? So again, even confessing your own sin, you're still guilty of the critique against God. So therefore, the vidui has to be an acknowledgement of the truth. That if our grandparents were exiled, our grandparents sinned. And the Darchei says that unless the vidui is bizvadu es avainam ves avon avaisam, unless it's a confession not only of our own sin, but the sin of our forefathers, then we will still be guilty. Not in the sense that the Rambam codifies. my personal tshuva will be complete. I've confessed my sins, and I've done whatever I have to do to atone for my sins. But the sin of critiquing God will still be there. Because if I sinned, but my parents and grandparents are innocent, so how do you explain why they went in the goals? So therefore you have to say, now this is a very, very, very difficult thing. Let me explain. I once heard a thought from Rabbi Shalom Gold. It's a very interesting thing. There's a Gemara Maseches Megillah that says, Shalu Talmidim es Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. The disciples asked Rav Shimon Bar Yochai about the Purim story. And we have a Purim story. In the story, there was a decree. Haman made a decree that the Jews are going to be annihilated. So it seems from the Megillah that really the Jews should have been annihilated. But Mordechai and Esther got the people to repent and to pray, and therefore the decree was averted. But if not for that, then the Jews would have been destroyed. So the Talmidim asked, tell me, he says, why were the Jews deserving of destruction? They must have been guilty of some sin. Because if not for their repentance and prayer, they would have been killed. That's, it seems, the story. So, okay, it turns out all's well that ends well. No one was killed. It was a magnificent victory because they repented. But if not for the repentance, they would have been killed. Why? What sin did they commit? So the Gemara discusses the various possibilities. Either because they attended the party of Achashverosh, or they bowed down to the idol in the days of Nebuchadnezzar. The Gemara gives the answers. Rabbi Gold pointed out an interesting thing. These are the disciples of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. How long after the Purim story did Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai live? Make a calculation of about 500 years. So we asked, for 500 years no one asked this question? Interesting thing. Now, it seems from the Gemara that the first people to raise this question were the disciples of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So then no one asked this question? So he said yes. Until now, until 500 years passed, no one had the audacity to ask this question. See, we have no problem pointing out the sins of people who lived long, long, long ago. So the Gemara says, okay, the first base of English was destroyed. Why was it destroyed? No problem. The three sins of Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, and Shvichas Dam. They committed idolatry, murder, and incest, and that's why the first base of English was destroyed. No problem. We could learn that Gemara without even batting an eyelash. No problem. Why was the second base of English destroyed? We all know that was the sin of sinas chinam. No problem. If someone would say to you, why did the Holocaust happen? So if anyone would try to give an answer to that question, say, how dare you speak about the holy people, the holy Jewish people, and point fingers? Now, how do you explain that? How is it, when we talk about the Jews who lived at the time of the first base of English, we have no problem. Yeah, they committed murder, incest, idolatry. They deserved it. The people of the Second Temple, they committed sinas chinam, unwarranted hatred of the fellow Jews. They deserved it. No problem. The answer is, when you're close to something in time, it's not abstract. It's real. We're not talking about these people that I'm totally disconnected from, my great-great-great-great-great-grandparents 30 generations before. We're talking about people that we are closer to in time. People that if we did not know, we at least heard of. Or at least we know people that knew of them. So it's too painful to contemplate. Too painful to contemplate. So therefore, we just don't want to even face that reality. Says Rabbi Gold that the Purim story For 500 years, no one could even contemplate the possibility that the Jews were deserving of destruction. And remember, nothing happened ultimately. Not a single Jew was killed in the Purim story. The Jews did repent, and the enemies of the Jewish people were defeated, and there was a tremendous victory for Klal Yisrael. And we have a Yontif of Purim, which is the happiest day of the year to celebrate that. But as we say in Gemara talk, but there was a Havamina, but it could have been different. It could have been that the Jews would have been destroyed. And that points to the fact that we're guilty of a sin. To contemplate what that sin might have been was so painful that until a distance of 500 years was achieved, no one even wanted to raise the issue. After 500 years, they were willing to ask the question and to discuss the possible answers. But we have to understand that, okay, if we're not going to give specific answers, and it's very difficult for the reasons that you mentioned, that we don't have Ruach HaKodesh, we don't have divine inspiration, we don't have that type of insight. So even if we would want to investigate why, we wouldn't know where to start. But nevertheless, the first thing we have to do is simply accept that the divine judgments are true. We don't have to give them explanations. We don't have to answer for God. But we have to accept that Mishpatei Hashem Emes, the judgments of God, are true. If we become critics of God, and as a consequence we develop theologies which would allow for undeserved suffering, which is a real critique of God. Because how could God possibly create a world where there was suffering that was uncalled for? Then we'll be guilty of this. So that is what the Vidu is saying. The Vidu is saying that you don't have to answer God. You don't have to explain exactly, this is why this happened. Maybe it's too painful, and maybe we're too close, and maybe we lack the ability. But we have to know that Mishpatei Hashem Emes, the judgments of God, are true. Yes?
On Rosh Hashanah, we actually ask that the judgments not be true, that they be merciful. If they were true, we don't think we could survive. We're trying to move God from the throne of judgment to the throne of mercy.
That's right, of course. Of course we want mercy. We want mercy. If we don't get mercy, then what do we get? We get the truth.
And we won't survive it.
But most people don't believe that. Most people believe that if we don't get mercy, we get undeserved suffering. We don't get the emes, right? We get something which is vindictive, something which is unfair. God flies off the handle. He throws the book at us.
Really?
I think most people do think like that, not religious Jews. But I think in the world, I think most people genuinely think this. Most people genuinely think that when suffering happens, God went berserk. And we talk about the celebrity atheists who have written so many books. And what is their argument, essentially? That it must be there is no God. Why? Because if there was a God, he would have to be a very, very cruel one. Right? And a lot of people buy into that. So it's true. Maybe we can't answer the questions. Maybe we can't answer the questions. Maybe we'd be better off if we would. But we can't. But this much we have to accept. That Mishpatei Hashem Emes, the judgments are true. And that's what we say. That V'atah Tzadik Al Kol Haba Aleinu. You are just in all that has come upon us. even if we can't understand it, right? But what do we do wrong? We don't know what it is we did wrong. We don't know what it is. We can't point to the measure for measure, the midah k'neged midah. But we accept the judgments, yes.
So can you go back to the part where it says the sins of our fathers? And the children of Babel, I understand. So for us to understand that, you think it's too close?
So the truth is this. The truth is that even there, right, I don't know necessarily if those grandchildren were able to articulate it was this sin or that sin or the other sin. But they were able to say, but there must have been a sin. There must have been a reason.
So
it didn't just happen, right? There
so
was a reason.
The Darchei is saying that that's the context of it.
So the context is that if we find that the grandchildren are saying the vidui, then it's not enough for them to say, we've sinned, but our parents are righteous.
Right. Okay, so
they have to say that our forefathers sinned. Whether they can identify the sin, I don't know. Maybe it was only 500 or 1,000 years later that the Chazal could identify the sin. But the point is, they admitted guilt. Alternately, they had the benefit of Nevi'im, they had the benefit of Ruach HaKodesh. It's different. Maybe they could identify the sins that were close in time. We don't have that advantage. But Siduk Adin is part of Vidui.
So, but that remains a part of our tefillah just as Masorah, or are we also supposed to understand that?
No, that's what I'm saying. That our Vidui echoes that idea. As we have to accept the divine judgment, right? Because we can't compound the sin by offering the critique of God. That is the point.
I got that, but what's that have to do with our fathers and our grandfathers?
Exactly, because if the suffering didn't begin with us, if the suffering began then, we can't say that, okay, until we came along, everything was perfect, it all started with us. What do you mean it started with us? The earlier generations also suffered. That means there has to be an acknowledgement that this is not something new. This is something that's been a problem all along. Maybe we can't articulate what the problem was. Maybe we can. But let me, to make it a bit easier, that maybe we can understand some of the things in Jewish history, let me share with you a very, very important comment of the Malbim in the book of Yeshua. And I think if we understand this well, it will give us a lot of understanding and even some peace of mind. There's a story in Yeshua that in the initial conquest of Eretz Yisrael, the first city the Jews conquered was called Yericho. Yericho. And as a remembrance, the Jewish people took an oath that the city of Yericho will be left as rubble, that no one will take anything from the spoils of Yericho. It will be a heap of rubble for all time to commemorate the great miracles that took place there. So although the city had treasures, undoubtedly there was silver and gold and valuable clothing, everything was meant to be left there just in a heap. There was a single person who violated the oath. His name was Ocham. It was Ocham. And he took some of the stuff from the city, he buried it under his tent, and he figured he can get away with it. The next city the Jews came to battle was a city named Ai. And in this battle, "36 Jews were killed. It was a defeat, and 36 Jews were killed. And this was considered a catastrophe, because that's not how this war is supposed to work. This war was meant to be miraculous. No casualties at all. Near 36 people were killed. And it was a failure. So it says Yeshua tore his clothes, and he fell on his face, and he prays to God, And God says to him, says, why are you falling on your face? Chata Yisrael. The Jewish people sinned. The Jewish people sinned. They violated the Cherem. They took the banned property. And Achan was identified and punished, and then the Jews were forgiven. Later in history, Yehoshua found himself in a situation where he had to rebuke the 2.5 tribes that lived on the eastern side of the Jordan River. It appeared, it was a mistake, but it appeared that they were planning on seceding. They were going to build their own Mishkan. That wasn't the case, but it appeared that way. And this was a terrible act, to sever their ties with the Jewish people. So it says, Yehoshua rebuked them. And Yehoshua said like this. He said, don't rebel against God. Because I'll tell you what the consequences of rebellion are. Halo Achan ben Zerach mo'al ma'al b'cherem. This one individual, not 2.5 tribes, one individual committed this offense. V'al kol adas Yisrael haya katzef. And the divine wrath was taken out on the entire nation. Because even though only 36 people died in that battle, but a military defeat is a national humiliation. V'hu ish echad lo gava ba'avono. And he yet did not die for his sin. 36 others died. The nation suffered a loss. And nothing happened to him. Now, this is a very interesting thing. But we'll come to that in a moment. So the point of Yeshua was, so you see the terrible consequence of the rebellion of one person. Imagine what will happen if 2.5 tribes rebel. So this was his admonition. But it's a very interesting thing that Yeshua points out, that the entire nation was punished and the guilty person was spared. How do you account for that? How do you explain that? So the Malbim has a magnificent explanation. He says that there are 2 types of divine punishments. One type of divine punishment is a directed punishment. You know, if a bolt of lightning strikes someone, so it was directed to that individual. In that instance, you have to assume that that person perhaps did some sin for which he was deserving of this punishment. The innocent person won't be struck in that way. The guilty person won't be struck in that way. But there's another type of punishment, which is when God removes his protection and we find ourselves in a dangerous place without divine protection, so then it's different. Because the divine protection is in the schus of the entire nation. The hashruas hashchina, the divine presence, that is the merit of the entire nation. If the nation is guilty as a whole, and the divine presence, the divine protection is removed, then the victims can be innocent people. And maybe even the guilty person will get off the hook. Because it's a different mechanism of punishment. It isn't a punishment which is direct. It's not like one of these laser-guided missiles that zeroes in on the target. The nation as a whole is undeserving of the divine protection, and then when you find yourself in a dangerous place, anything can happen. And it could be that the guilty are spared and the innocent are killed, but that's what happens. In a dangerous place without divine protection, there are consequences. The Malbim says that was the case. No, a battlefield is a dangerous place. You're waging a war. And there was a siluk, there was a removal of the divine presence because of the sin of Achan, and really compounded by the fact that no one protested. There were people that knew, and no one stopped him. So the nation as a whole was not worthy of having the divine protection. So therefore, in a dangerous place, things happen. But you can't point fingers and say, well, these were killed, they must have been guilty, these were spared, they must have been innocent. No, it doesn't work that way. It could be that the ones who were killed were the ones who were innocent, the ones who were spared, the ones who were guilty. Once God removes his protection, the laws of nature take over. That's what the Malbim says was the story over there. And I think that perhaps this might be a thought to keep in mind when we talk about the great inexplicable historic events, the great calamities in Jewish history, where it's not just that Jews suffer losses, but it seems that the wrong people get it. That the good and the righteous are the victims, and often it's the people who are wicked that get off. And you wonder, like, how did that happen? Now, the answer is that we're not talking about a conventional type of punishment. We're not talking about a direct punishment. We're talking about a siluk, a removal of the divine hashgach, of the divine presence, in a very dangerous place. Golus generally is a dangerous place. When we are under the dominion of the nations of the world who do not like us, that is a very dangerous place to be. We need divine protection. If as a nation we don't merit that divine protection, there can be consequences. So therefore, when we see that, how could it be that great Talmidei Chacham and great Tzaddikim, they were killed, and many people who were really almost Rishoyim were spared? How do you account for that? This Malbim gives a cheshbon. So whether we can apply it, whether we can't apply it, these are things which are beyond our grasp. But the important thing is to accept the judgments as emes. That's siduk hadin.
And don't those righteous people have to deserve it for it to be tzedek, complete righteousness and complete justice? If there is a stain in the nation and innocent children and innocent people are dying, how can that fall in tzedek? I'm just trying to figure out, there has to be that they have to be deserving, the individuals.
That's the Malbim is saying not that way. He's saying very simply like this. Let's say I exercise my free will to harm somebody. Right? That might be a person who otherwise was innocent. Otherwise wouldn't have died. So it's the same thing. That when the nation as a whole makes bad choices, which bring about a siluk hashchina, a departure of the Shekhinah, well, the consequence of those bad choices can be harm that befalls the best. It's a frightening thing. But this is the point he's making. But the point I want to make is this. Again, I'm not saying any answers to these serious questions. Who am I to try to answer these questions? I'm saying that we as Jews have to know that we have an obligation to accept the divine judgments as true. But this is all when it refers to the judgments that befall other people. When it refers to the personal suffering I experience, here certainly we have to think very, very carefully, right, about where we've gone wrong. And keep in mind that so much suffering in life is self-inflicted. The Pasuk says, Ivelas Adam Tesalev Darchei, a person's foolishness corrupts his own way. V'al Hashem Yizaf Libo, and the person is angry at God. A lot of misery we have in life, a lot of emotional suffering that we experience. Emotional suffering is also suffering. A lot of emotional suffering is also really our fault. Because if we'd be willing to get sometimes the professional help that we would need, then problems could be addressed. But people aren't willing. People are too proud. Maybe they're too attached to their money. So instead they let emotional problems fester, relationship problems fester. So you can have a family where the husband and wife are at odds, parents and children, vice versa. And maybe with some professional help, for example, a lot of the suffering could be alleviated. And yet, why not? Because we're not willing to do what we have to do. I am not going to a shrink. I don't need help. I don't need help. I'm too proud to admit I don't need help. And the fact is that who then can you blame for that suffering? It's only yourself. Because if you get the help, maybe it's a problem that could be easily dealt with. But you're not willing to go get the help, so therefore you're condemned to suffer. Are you going to blame God for that? It's something that if you didn't bring upon yourself, you're certainly maintaining it on yourself. And there are so many things in life that are like that. Right? And we blame the Ribono Shel Olam. And that's what the Darchei is telling us in this parsha. And that's what the authors of the Slicha said. That so much of life really, we see ourselves as being innocent and perfect, and as a result, our sufferings we see as a criticism of God. That is a compounding of the sin. That is a compounding of the sin. But what is the point? The point is like this, that we daven Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Implicit in all our prayers is we want to have be signed and sealed for a good year. If we want to have a good year, then we have to be willing to work for it. We have to be willing to work to put our finances in order. We have to be willing to work to put our emotional lives in order. We have to be willing to work to put our health in order. But if we aren't willing to make that effort, then the pain of financial discomfort, or the pain of ill health, or the pain of emotional problems, we can't lay at God's doorstep. And we have to accept responsibility for ourselves. Of course, there are areas in life, many areas in life, which are in His control. So there, we have to pray, we have to daven, we have to do tshuva, right? But what is within our hands, we have to be able to do. And all too often, we lay the blame at God, and therefore we compound our irresponsibility by criticizing God. Because that is a fundamental aspect of the Vidu, of Tziduk Hadin. Tziduk Hadin. So we understand that God's judgments are justified. If what we experience is punishment for a sin, then we accept that and we repent. If the suffering we're experiencing is not a punishment for a sin, but rather a suffering that we brought upon ourselves, we are willing to acknowledge that, recognize that, do something about it. And if we're going to make kabbalas, if we're going to make commitments, it may be that these are areas we should think about. We should think about the ways in which we make our own lives better. Because when we do that, we take responsibility for those parts of our life which are in our control. Instead of blaming God, we will lay the blame where it belongs, which is at our own doorstep. And that's something which I think is very, 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 very important. We're talking about tshuva, and most of us think that tshuva involves learning more Torah and davening more and saying more Tehillim and giving more tzedakah and so on and so forth. Rav Kook writes in the Oros HaTshuva, there's an aspect of tshuva which he calls tshuva tivis, which is natural tshuva. Natural tshuva is improving one's life in ways that will ultimately allow religious observance to fall into place. A person who finds himself nervous and irritable and angry, his religious life will also suffer. If a person can work to acquire serenity and menuchas hanefesh, peace of mind, then his religious life will thrive. So a lot of the things we have to work on are not religious issues per se. They are life issues. They are life issues. Coping with stress, coping with anger, repairing our relationships, and so on and so forth. When we do these things, our lives will be better. That's also part of tshuva. And if a person thinks of tshuva again only in the religious terms, I'm going to be more precise about how much water I use to wash my hands from the Tilas Yadayim. I'm going to be more precise about which hechsherim I allow into my kitchen. No, it's very nice. It's very nice to be very scrupulous about these things. But I think in terms of leverage, we're going to get a lot more if we tackle the life's issues. Because here we're dealing with pain and suffering, which is self-inflicted, which is within our power to deal with. And, we approach it as if, it's all God's fault. Right? Siduk Hadin means accepting responsibility. That we are willing to accept responsibility. For those things that are consequences of actual sin, we accept responsibility, and that we acknowledge we sin. But in those aspects of life where the suffering and the pain is self-inflicted, we have to accept responsibility for that too. And if we straighten those things out, I think that we will go a long way towards having a very, very successful life over the next year. Let's imagine if we could really, throw away all those self-inflicted injuries and live lives of peace and serenity and happiness and contentment, and slowing down to smell the flowers and enjoy God's blessings. Yom Kippur gives us so much, and we don't appreciate it because we are in this frenetic mode, rushing, doing, etc. What do you think that counts in God's book? That I've bestowed so many gifts and so much kindness upon you, and you just don't appreciate it. You don't enjoy it. So there's a lot to think about. Be'ezus Hashem, that if we accept responsibility and we engage in this process of tziduk hadin, acknowledgement God's judgments are just, hopefully Be'ezus Hashem will go a long way towards setting us on the right track of a tshuva shleima. Be'ezus Hashem, we should all merit a gemar chasima tov, a final seal for a very good, happy, successful new year, and a very, very joyous Sukkot to follow. We will have a class next week.